Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at a bit of an introduction to representation and how that's going to be relevant to what you need to be doing for pretty much, let's say, at least the first 2 units of the CTEC media course. So in this video I'm going to introduce you to the concept of representation in visual media. We're going to be looking at how camera work, mise-en-scène and narrative can be used to create representations, and then we're going to be looking at quite a specific topic that's going to be relevant to Unit 1, which is going to be the representations of gender that you often associate specifically within horror films. So this is quite relevant to the first unit, which is obviously going to be looking at horror films. And it's also quite relevant to your Unit 13 as well, because you might want to consider how you might, create various representations in your practical coursework. So obviously the reason why we're doing this is sort of similar to what I just said really. You need to understand how camera work, narrative and mise-en-scène can be used to create representations, and you'll also need to be analysing representations of real media products as well as applying it to your own creative works. That's pretty much what I just said, to be honest. Okay, so when we're talking about representation, it is a very, very big issue that is probably pretty much been going on in the media for forever, to be honest. So representations is how it can be a person, it could be a group of people, it could be an object, it could be a thing. And we're looking at how are they presented to audiences. So the really important thing that you need to think of is whenever you see anything in a media product, like I said before, whether it's a person or a group of people, they are all presented to audiences in a specific way. And the way they are presented to us is it's constructed, okay? And it's made through the various use of things like camera work and mise-en-scène or narrative, for example, okay? So all those different uses of media language can represent people in different ways. So the thing you need to understand is that the way that people are represented in a media product does not always represent facts, okay? It is a representation to audiences. So let me give you a little example. If you look at this picture of Captain America here, you would argue that the way that he is meant to be represented on this poster is very, very positive, okay? And you can tell that through the media language and how it's been used in that poster. So the one that's obviously the most striking, first of all, is the camera work, okay? The shot type. You look at that low angle shot there, he's looking down on us, okay? He's looking very dominant, he's looking very powerful, okay? But also look at the mise-en-scène. Look at his facial expression. He's very clean cut. He's got a very determined look on his face. He's got that quiet sort of, strong posture and body language, okay? He's got the clenched fist to show that he's really strong and tough. And all that is representing him as being very positive, okay? However, the representations of this image would be very, very different if they had used, say, for example, a high angle shot, or he had a facial expression that showed him as being scared, okay? That representation would completely change based on the way that the media language has been used. So that's the really important thing you've got to get your head around, is representations are created, okay? And they're created and represented to audiences in the way the person who made the media product wants them to be represented, okay? Okay, so the first thing we need to look at is how representations, a lot of them are based around stereotypes, okay? So I just wanted to quickly go over what the definition of a stereotype is. I'm sure you all know what it is, but it doesn't hurt to go over it one more time. So stereotypes, a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image of a particular person or thing. Now, because we're going to be looking at gender representation in a bit more detail, stereotypes are often, some of the common representations you get of gender are largely based around stereotypes, okay? But it's also, if you look at things like race and ethnicity and age as well, these stereotypes are very, very commonly seen when we're talking about representation, okay? Now, obviously, what we need to be aware of is stereotypes aren't real, okay? They're not true, all right? But the way they are represented is very, very common. So if you look at gender representation in most mainstream media, you would argue that some very stereotypical male traits are that men tend to be seen as very heroic. They're very strong, they're very emotionless, they're very successful. You know, they've got courage, okay? You look at someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger here, look at the size of his muscles and that gun and the determined look on his face. He's strong, he's brave, he's independent, okay? He's, you know, clearly someone who's a bit of a leader, okay? Whereas female stereotypes are commonly, or females are commonly seen as being the opposite to the male stereotypes. They're weak, they're emotional, sometimes you might even say they're over-emotional, okay? They're very maternal, okay? So they're defined by the fact that they might be a parent, okay? Or a housewife. This one's very important as well, the idea that they're reliant on men, okay? And finally, and this we'll look at this a bit more detail as well, one of the very common historical female stereotypical traits is that women are there to be objectified. Okay, they're meant to be seen as someone who is a sex object and seen for their, you know, sexuality rather than, you know, them as a person. But we'll go on to that in a bit more detail when we look at one of the key theories that we need to look at. Oh, in fact, we're on to that right now. So, one of the key theories that we're going to be looking at with regards to gender representation is the male gaze, which is a theory from Laura Mulvey. Okay, and the male gaze is the idea that when we see women in any form of visual media, we see them from that they're often shown from the point of view of a heterosexual male. So what do we mean by that? It's the idea that when we see a woman in any form of visual media, the media language is there to objectify them. Okay, they're being gazed upon rather than being looked at, if that makes sense. So they're often seen as sex objects, and the sexualization of them is very unnecessarily shown through things like close-ups or extreme close-ups. You know, you might get close-ups of particular body parts. Okay, you might find that the costume is quite revealing. Okay, it might be quite a you know, a costume that is very sort of, you know, shows off the figure. Okay, the makeup might be quite glamorous, okay, and over the top and not very naturalistic. Okay, the performance as well, the performance of the woman could be quite passive. Okay, they could be quite subservient to the male characters. Okay, and finally their role in the narrative as well. You might even find women being seen as a prize for the hero. You know, that's the reward for the hero to save the day. Okay, so the male gaze is a very, very important theory that we need to look at when we're looking at gender representation in media. Okay, now the last thing I need to go through is we need to look at some of the gender stereotypes that you often see in horror films. So we're going to look at 3 stereotypes for women and 1 for men, okay? And the first one is probably one of the most common representations of gender that you often see in horror films, and that's the idea of a female character being a damsel in distress. Okay, so a damsel in distress character, a very, very traditional representation of females in horror films, and it's the idea that they are someone who needs rescuing. Okay, they might be captured by the monster or the killer or whatever it may be, and they need to be saved by the man. They're often characters who are very, very highly sexualized, so they're often seen through the male gaze. So if you look at this character here, she's got quite a revealing costume on there, okay? They're very over-emotional and needy, so you can see here that she's fainted, okay, because she saw this thing here, which she probably would, to be honest. And we assume she's going to be rescued by the male character, okay? She might be someone who's a bit of a nuisance or a hindrance, and often, the picture doesn't show that, but often you might find these characters are blonde as well, which sort of links into that stereotype of the dumb blonde, which is quite a common trope. They're very weak, physically, mentally, emotionally, and probably the most important one as well at the bottom is that they're very promiscuous, okay? They commit wrongdoings or sins. They might, if you look at horror films, most horror films, especially the early horror stories, they started out as tales of morality, okay? And the idea is that characters who committed acts that were sinful or wrong, like things like sex outside marriage or drinking alcohol, etc., or drugs, they were punished for that and they died, okay? And that was often seen in damsel in distress characters, okay? Characters who were promiscuous and, you know, for example, had sex, they got killed as punishment for that. Okay, and characters who didn't have sex, didn't do drugs, didn't drink, they survived. Okay, so damsel in distress, quite a common character trait. Okay, so over emotional. Okay, they might be sort of quite hysterical in a way, I suppose is a good word to put on there. Okay, the second one. The second one is more of a female character being seen as an antagonist. Okay, they're the antagonist of the narrative, and this is called the monstrous feminine. All right, and usually this character will take the place of some form of monster. Okay, so witches and vampires are the most common ones, and this is quite an interesting stereotype because it originates from men's fear of women and fear of, women stopping men having their masculinity. Okay, the idea of them being castrated and getting rid of their masculineness, I suppose, which is a word that I've just made up. So it's quite a interesting stereotype. It's usually brought around by, the interesting thing about it is the monstrous feminine are usually brought, their desire to kill people or kill men especially is brought about because of traditional gender roles. So what we mean by that is the idea that a female character might be driven to the urge to kill to get revenge on someone who harmed their child, almost like it's a protective role. Okay, so a good example of that would be Jason's mother from Halloween, if anyone's seen that. Her entire motivation is the fact that she wants to get revenge from someone who harmed her son. So her motivation is driven by her maternal instinct. Okay, they're often very highly sexualized as well, and they use their sexuality as a weapon. Okay, that weapon lures men. Okay, usually. And the last one is a stereotype called the final girl. Now, this final girl is meant to usually be some sort of polar opposites to the damsel in distress. So the final girl is a character, she's the last one to survive in the film. Okay, she's usually the one who defeats the antagonist, or at least delays him, because obviously then you get like a million sequels. She does survive the film, and she survives the film through initiative and intelligence, so she's clever. She's cleverer than the antagonist. Now, this is the important thing. She is not highly sexualized, and she doesn't conform to female stereotypical traits. So if we go back and look at our stereotypical female traits, that they're being gentle, weak, emotional, whatever, they might not necessarily fall into some of these tropes. Okay, they might have some more masculine traits there, for example. Okay, so there will have some damsel in distress characteristics, so maybe one or two of these, but not a lot of them. Okay, so like I said, they might have some masculine traits as well. They're not highly sexualized, so they're not shown through the male gaze. This is quite an interesting one as well. They sometimes will have what's called a gender ambiguous name. And what a gender ambiguous name is, that's a name that can be used for both a male and a female. So something like Ripley or Sydney, Alex, something like that. Okay, it's can be used for either gender. And finally, we've got the male stereotype of horror film. Now, there isn't really that many male stereotypes in horror films, but the most common one is the idea of the arrogant jock character, which you see in a lot of like teen slasher films. So this character, they're usually very, very popular. They're usually sort of, I don't know, if it's an American horror film, captain of the football team or something like that. And though these characters are usually very arrogant, they're usually very overconfident. They might even be in a relationship with the damsel in distress or final girl. Okay, they would be very stereotypical in terms of their gender traits. Okay, they would be this particular kind of person. Okay, however, it's these traits that might end up being their downfall. So you might find someone, a jock character, who tries to defeat the killer through his brute strength and ends up getting killed. Okay, it's more often that these characters are very unsympathetic as well. We don't like them. Okay, they deserve to die because they're not very nice people. Okay, now there's quite a lot of different horror films that there's sort of a lot of stereotypes that you could look at for horror films, but with regards to gender, these are probably the most common ones, okay, and the ones we're going to focus on in some of our textual analysis lessons. With representation now, what you need to be thinking about is not necessarily what the representations are of a person, but how are those representations created. So what we will look at when we come to textually analyse our horror films is not necessarily does the film conform to any of these stereotypes, but how are those stereotypes created? How is this person represented as a stereotypical final girl? How is this person represented as a stereotypical monstrous feminine character? Okay, how has the use of things like camera shots and mise-en-scène and narrative created these representations, created these stereotypes? Okay, it's all very well good to say, oh yeah, this person's clearly a damsel in distress character. Okay, that's fine, but what we're really interested in is how. What tells you this information? Okay, where's the evidence? Okay, where's the media language that helps conform to this particular representation? Okay, so just as a quick recap, representation, how is someone or a group of people presented to an audience? Okay, is it positive? Is it negative? Okay, but more importantly, how has that representation been created? Okay, how has the filmmaker made audiences think this way about a certain character or a certain group of people? Okay, we are going to focus a lot on gender, but representations can be applied to, you know, lots of different things. It could be gender, it could be race and ethnicity, it could be age, etc. There's lots of different areas of representation to focus on. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If anyone needs any more help with that or anything don't understand, send me an email. But yeah, that's pretty much it.